I actually stopped my reading of the Haftarah one verse too soon, so I'd like to add that verse now and use that as a segue into my few words for this morning. I had intended to read from verse 6, chapter 52, verse 6. So if you still have your Bibles open, you can go there. In verse 5, God through Isaiah is complaining, where God says, "What is it that I have to do here?" Meaning among the captives out in Babylonia and in Assyria. My people was taken there for nothing. And then God says, "Their mockers howl," declares God, "and constantly, unceasingly, my name is reviled." Meaning they're saying that your God has abandoned you. And then God says the following to the people in Isaiah chapter 52, verse 6, "Lachen yeda ami shmi." Therefore, my people will know my name. And this idea of the name of God, which beautifully the idea of what it means to know God, what it means to know God's name last Friday night. Lachen bayom hahu ki ani hu hamendaber, because on that day, ani hu hamendaber, I am the one that is speaking, hineni. So this idea is a rather mystical idea. It's used historically in the concept that the rabbis call hester panim, meaning the hidden face of the divine. When evil things happen, especially to the people of Israel, people say there is a time of hester panim, that the presence of God is somehow hidden. God has not departed. It's not that God is not God, but rather the blessing presence of God is somehow obscured. And so this idea of hester panim is one of the rabbinic terms for evil. Evil in the mind of the rabbis is when the divine becomes obscure. So here the divine is saying, "Ani medaber," it is I, God, who is now speaking. God is speaking to reality, and then it ends with hineni. So God is saying, "Here I am." I'd like to use that as a segue into my thoughts about Rosh Hashanah that I'd like to share with you. I'm paraphrasing from Sfat Emet, my favorite Hasidic teacher. And as he speaks about Rosh Hashanah, he takes it into a quite mystical dimension. I'd like to walk you into that. But first share, as we share with every holiday, how to study a holiday. So first of all, as we come upon the month of Elul preceding Rosh Hashanah, let's take a quick look at Rosh Hashanah just for a moment and then move into this mystical approach of the Sfat Emet. Remember, Hasidism is a form of Kabbalah, is a form of Jewish mysticism. So first of all, what are the texts that we have of Rosh Hashanah? Almost none in the Bible. There's almost nothing in the Bible about Rosh Hashanah. In fact, the one time Rosh Hashanah is mentioned in the Bible, if I'm not mistaken, it actually seems to refer to Yom HaKippurim. Where do we find many texts on Rosh Hashanah? We find it in the Mishnah for sure. We find a discussion of the 4 different New Years, all based on tithing, for example. For example, the first of Elul is the New Year for the tithing of animals. You tithe animals depend on what year the animals are born. You have New Years of kings, New Years of human beings, etc. So there are 4 New Years listed in the Mishnah. You can go look that up. The New Year of the first of Tishri is understood to be the New Year of the world, when the world is created. And in the Midrash and in the Talmud, there's a lot of discussion about the creation of Adam and Eve. It's rather complex. The texts aren't clear. I'll go into them later. But more or less, going from the Midrash, we'll look at the rabbinic idea that the world was created on Rosh Hashanah. Here's the conflict in the Talmud. The question is whether the human being was created on Rosh Hashanah or whether the world was created on Rosh Hashanah. If the world is created on the first of Tishri, then the human being is created on the 6th day of Tishri, the 6th day of creation. So some rabbis say that the world was created on the 25th day of Elul, or the 24th. I always get that mixed up. And therefore, the Rosh Hashanah is the birthday of the human being, that Adam, which includes Adam, eventually Adam v'Chava, Adam and Eve, but initially the one androgynous human being, is created on again, this is all metaphorically. There was no time, no calendar yet on Rosh Hashanah. So it is both the birthday of the world, but especially the birthday of the moral world, the birthday of the human being. That's the most important event, quasi-historical event that we connect to Rosh Hashanah. And again, where do we get this? We get this from the Mishnah, from the Talmud, the Midrash, and many, many other texts. So therefore, what is the symbolic meaning? Remember, we go from the historical dimension, the textual dimension, and now the symbolic dimension. There's a couple of symbols that you see in rabbinic literature, and one is the symbol of the courtroom. So just as the human being mythically is created on Rosh Hashanah, the human being is judged on Rosh Hashanah, mythically and metaphorically, because we human beings, according to our tradition, were brought into being for a purpose. The purpose of our lives is connected to the meaning of our lives. In some very deep sense, the meaning of our lives is to live our lives in accordance with a moral order. I'll call a moral and a spiritual order. That's one of the things we want to take into Rosh Hashanah, is the existentialist experience of coming into consciousness, unless one has a very, very dense tradition that teaches you how to think about the world in such a way that you never question. Well, unless you're born into or have adopted what I'm going to call now a highly orthodox, evangelical, or fundamentalist point of view, the meaning of life, the meaning of the world is up to question. Many people ask, what is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of my life? Unless you grew up in a dense faith tradition, the meaning of life is oftentimes an open question. One discovers meaning and then one loses meaning. In fact, from an existentialist perspective, this is one of it causes a kind of, as Sartre called, a kind of a nausea, a kind of a vertigo, that you don't know who you are, where you belong, what life is about, what you're supposed to be doing, what's important, what's not important. People say, don't sweat the small stuff. Somebody else writes a book that says it's all the small stuff. We don't know what we're doing or what we're supposed to be doing. But our tradition, as I think every tradition tells us, that life does have meaning. The meaning is living our lives in accordance with some kind of transcendent order. By the way, there is not a claim that we know exactly what the transcendent order is or exactly what we're supposed to do, just that there is one, and that a part of the purpose of our lives is to discover the nature of that transcendent order. I just thought of a quip last night as I was reviewing what I taught last night and my teaching for today. Part one is there is a transcendent order, and if anybody claims they know what the transcendent order is, that person is out of order, meaning nobody knows exactly what the transcendent order is. We're all trying to find our way toward it. And the question is, how do we find out what that transcendent order is? How do we live our lives around it? How do we create communities around it? So number one, the meaning of our lives, the purpose of our lives is connected to the idea that there is a metaphysical reality. This is something I talk about constantly. There is something called the good for the human being. It's not the greatest good for the greatest number, by the way. I think that's an impossible algorithm. We're just going to say that there's something called the good, and the good can be understood with four major rubrics, as you know: love, justice, truth, beauty. There are others, but I think that's enough to organize our consciousness. So, if on the birth of the human being, we're born into a transcendent order that has a sense of the good, which means there are better and worse ways to love, to create justice, to create beauty, and to search for truth, we know we human beings fall short. So that's a key component of our theory of the human being, is that the human being falls short. The question in Judaism is, why does the human being fall short? Why are we confused? Why do we so often get it wrong about ourselves, about other people, about the nature of things? Because there's a resistance to both knowing what is true, knowing what is good. But even if we know what is true and what is good, or we have a close approximation to what is true and what is good, there's resistance to our acting on it that we call the Yetzer Hara. So just to review, what is the human condition? We're born into a transcendent order. We have the inner capacity as we do our work to come closer and closer to understand what this transcendent order is, what the meaning of our life is, and therefore what the purpose of our life is in any given moment, which is to live according to that transcendent order. We have natural limitations to understanding it, so we have to constantly do work to understand what is true, what is right, and what is good. What is the impediment to knowing what is true, right, and good? We call that the destructive formation. Yetzer is from the Hebrew word form. So there's a destructive formation in us that's working against our understanding what this order is. And even if one were to discover what the order is, there's an inhibition against it. So let me just give you a couple of examples. In my many, many years of counseling, and of course looking at myself, there's a moment when a person realizes, for example, and again, I'm saying something I repeat constantly. I would stop repeating it if I didn't encounter it in counseling just about every single week of my life. So if I have a full month where I do not discover someone yet again discovering the damage that angering and defensiveness does, I'll stop talking about it. I will assume that the word got out, everybody got the memo, we're done with that, we're moving on. It has not yet happened. So yet another case where some person did something in the relationship that somebody considered was wrong. As I heard it, I thought to myself, well, this could have actually been worked out very peaceably. No great offense was given, except somebody got their feelings hurt. Somebody was disappointed. The disappointed person, on the other hand, completely lost it. Another way to say it is, there was some disappointment, and the offended party did not know how to soothe, did not know how to calm down. Now, what very often happens in these situations is that a person says, since I am not soothed, you must have done something terrible, and you need to be the one who soothes me. Now, I think to some extent, I think in loving relationships, we all ought to try to soothe each other. But I hope you can all see, number one, I hope you're probably familiar with this, and you see how destructive this is. You see at some very deep level how untrue this is, that our feelings determine the moral offense of another person. How we feel does not determine reality. I'll quit talking about that when these things stop coming across my life. Over and over again, I hear, and probably in the counseling that I did when we were away, and there was some emergency counseling since we've been back, and there's been kind of a backlog. Many times it comes down to the point where a person says, other people cause my feelings. If I feel bad, they caused it. The degree to which I feel bad is the degree to which they offended me, as opposed to saying, what this other person actually was quite small. My feelings are disproportionate. That is a measure of saintliness. The second thing is, when a person stays upset, they often say to the other person, you have not resolved the matter. You haven't done enough to make this better. I hear this over and over again. I think any psychologist would say, many people have a difficult time self-soothing. The fact that a person is not self-soothed does not mean someone else has done something wrong. There's a limit to which we can soothe another person who cannot self-soothe. Again, this is something that I've talked about forever. I've seen it my entire professional life. I've certainly witnessed within myself, and I've tried to be, hopefully more successfully than not, the person that can say, the fact that I am not soothed does not mean the other person hasn't done everything they could. It might just be I who am deficient in my capacity to self-soothe. Okay? So let's take that as an example of the human condition is that we suffer shatteredness and brokenness as a human being. That's true. A part of the meaning and purpose of our lives is to live lives of goodness, which is not to feel this kind of horrible pain within and cause pain to other people. I think that's true. Part of the meaning and purpose of our lives is to not feel pain, inner pain, unnecessarily and disproportionately, nor cause it to other people. I think that should be obvious to all of us here. That fact is, we do suffer unnecessarily and disproportionately. We cause other people to suffer unnecessarily. And then the question is, what ought we do about it? Okay, so one thing we ought to do about it is learn how to soothe ourselves and exit from our own inner pain. That seems obvious. We all should learn how to do this. The problem is people don't know how to do it. It's not something in my mind that you can read in a book. You can read a book about it. It's not going to do the work for you. I know people have been in therapy a long time. It does not seem to be effective in getting people to self-soothe because one thing is missing, I think, in all therapy, including all counseling, including mine. There's one element in the way of people being able to self-soothe, which I will talk about in just a moment. So whatever it is in us that causes to take our pain out on other people, ascribe to people actions based on the severity of our hurt, which is an irrational disproportionality, putting it in Kabbalistic perspectives, is part of Olam Shikara, is the world of the lie. I feel this way because of what you did, as opposed to saying, you triggered something already inside of me. I will take responsibility for my own inner life. We can discuss what you're pulling the trigger lately, but it's my trigger. It existed inside me. So here's an example where you might say from an ideal perspective, we're creating for meaning and purpose. One of that is to create inner good, good with us and other people. Because of forces within us, we hurt other people. We ascribe to them intentions and deeds based on how we feel, not based on what we did. In fact, sometimes we can't even get to an understanding of what people said and what people did. Therefore, we are trapped in our own, and I don't mean this in a negative way, I mean it in an essential way, the way of the human condition. We're all trapped in our narcissistic shell. The world is a reflection of the prison that we have created, that we live in until we decide not to. Okay, so as we go into Rosh Hashanah, as we're moving into this day of transformation, we go into the month of Elul, aiming toward transformation, looking for transformation, and I want to begin today on familiar territory to all of us. And again, I wouldn't be talking about it if it weren't at least every other week, sometimes once a week, this exact problem comes up over and over again, where people say, I feel because of what you did, and the degree of my feelings is connected to the degree of your offense, as opposed to something that is spiritually deeply true. Yes, other people do things. Other people say hurtful things. That's true. That we need to take responsibility for our own inner lives. Now, what is the mystical source of this? I'd like to share with you the mystical source rooted in the Sfat Emet. The Sfat Emet, this is actually from a drash that he gave, if I'm not mistaken, in 1877. 23 years old, just became the Rabbi of Gur. He's clearly paraphrasing from his sainted grandfather, who was his teacher. And the teacher of his sainted grandfather was the Kotzker Rebbe. So there's a Kotzker Rebbe feel in Sfat Emet, which is intolerance for self-deception, intolerance for Olam Shikara, intolerance for excuses, intolerance for not demanding of ourselves the highest levels of consciousness, of character, and conduct. So he says, Rosh Hashanah. So if you read my introduction to my teachings for today, in the Hasidic tradition, the word Shana, year, is connected to the Hebrew word lishanot, which means to change, to transform. Lehishtanot is personal transformation. Shinui means change and transformation. So he's translating Rosh Hashanah is the time before differentiation. It sounds like a very sophisticated idea for a rabbi in Warsaw in the 1870s to say, but remember, these were mystics. They understood the idea that there is a one undifferentiated divine and then things get broken down into particles of reality, and ultimately those narcissistic prisons and prisms into which we are born and which we must transcend. So he says, Perush kodam hitchalkut hashefa liot nishnaneh. So the shefa is the flowing of the divine, and there's a time that is called kodam hitchalkut. Chalakim are pieces. Kodam hitchalkut, before everything broke apart, is what we call Rosh Hashanah, prior to the breakage, okay? Before the hitchalkut. And then he says, Ki keshaba chiyut Hashem, that when the essential vitality or life of God comes into the world, in the world of time and nature, he says, Tachat hazman v'ateva, meaning our world governed by laws of nature, governed by physics, Mishtaneh miruchaniyut legashmiut. So spirit becomes gashmi, becomes flesh. Now, spirit becoming flesh is a metaphor. It's not the opposition between spirit and flesh. It's something, the idea, and again, I'm translating from my knowledge of the sources, is that spirit takes on interest. Spirit takes on interest. Spirit takes on ego interest. So instead of being loyal to the life of spirit, we're loyal to ego interest. Now, this idea of what our ego interests are is a very deep idea that I hope to develop. But the more you go into the life of spirit, your only interest is understanding love, justice, truth, and beauty. I think the authentic dimensions of the life of spirit. And then trying to live in loyalty to the life of spirit. Instead of that, we have something called the ego self, and consciousness becomes arranged in such a way that we want to fulfill the interest of the ego self. For example, in this case of the person who gets hurt, becomes very angry, it's in their interest that somebody else take responsibility for their feelings. It's in their interest. I mean, think how simple that is. Whenever I feel bad, it's someone else's fault. Therefore, I don't have any work to do. They have work to do. If I feel badly, they have an obligation to soothe me. I don't have an obligation to self-soothe. That's one of the basic lies of the ego self. So that, by the way, it's something that's unconscious, because sometimes when I confront people with this, I'll say, week after week, year after year, that you have a responsibility to self-soothe and you can't rely on other people. And the beginner says, but Rabbi Finley, you don't know what they did. They rehearsed what they did. And I say, I hear what they did. I'm just going to say to you honestly, your reaction seems disproportionate. And the person takes that deep breath. It's a very familiar deep breath when I hear it. The person says, you're right. What they did was small. My feelings were disproportionate. My feelings were gargantuan relative to the small thing that a person did, quite unintentionally, maybe even out of their control. Then the person has to look at themselves, and they realize that what they've been doing is assigning to the other person a reality that didn't exist. The reality was in them, including the obligation to soothe. So I've heard people say, well, they didn't do enough to make me feel better. I said, maybe they couldn't do enough to make you feel better because maybe your inner breakage is not their fault. Now, this is something, again, I see every single week. And there's that moment when a person comes to consciousness. So using this language, before the hitchalkut, before consciousness being broken down into ego interest, is the way I'm translating this. And you move back to a consciousness which is the consciousness is the inner good before the breakage. The conscious is love, justice, beauty, and truth of the way things are. I'll say truth of proportionality, the truth about our feelings and emotions, the truth about other people. You connect with that, and suddenly people take a deep breath, and it's as if they can see. They can see other people, they can see themselves, and they take a deep breath, and then they say, almost to a person, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? I constantly do this. For one person, it's the angry side. For one person, it's the defensive side. There are 20 different versions of these ego states I see constantly. When the person can see them, it's as if they're seeing the world before the hitchalkut, life fragmenting into ego self-interest. They align themselves with the interest of spirit, the ruchaniyut, before the gashmiyut. Again, that means corporality in literally. I'm translating it as the interest of the ego self. Person takes a breath and say, what happens to me? What's wrong with me? Sometimes people feel shame. And of course, here's where the Kabbalistic spiritual psychology comes in. And I say to a person, there's nothing wrong with you. You're experiencing the breakage. Every person experiences the breakage in a different way. This is your experience of the breakage. No need for shame. No need for self-hatred. No need to hate somebody else. We're all carrying the breakage. The question is, what are we going to do about it? So the Sfat Emet says, one of the things we do before, as we move into the month of Elul, is try to capture within the inner moment before the breakage. Rosh ha'hitchalkut, before things, as it were, diversify into ego self-interest. Then it says, Rosh Hashanah hu hamakor, is the source before the hitchalkut. Before everything gets divided into ego self-interest, there is a source, there is a makor, the headwaters, as it were. Kodem ha'hishtanut ki b'mekoro hu bli tziur gashmi. Because at its source, again, I'm going to translate the term gashmi to ego self-interest. There's a source before it becomes ego self-interest. There's a vitality. There's a spirituality, a ruchaniyut. And from this mystical perspective, I would say one of the initial stage before any work of transformation. And remember, this is about transformation. Whatever else Rosh Hashanah is about, it's about transformation. And that's the main way I teach it here from Hasidic sources at our synagogue. It's about transformation. Whatever else you want to be doing during the month of Elul is forgiving, granting forgiveness, asking forgiveness. There are many things that we do, many practices. But in my mind, they all come back to this meditative, contemplative moment of moving your consciousness inside yourself, Rosh Hashanah, before the hitchalkut, before consciousness gets broken down, before you start settling scores, rehearsing wounds, blaming people, blaming yourself, before any of that, there's a world of pure spirit that exists within you. Now, for some people, this might sound too mystical, too contemplative. I'm going to say for those of you, please try it. It's something quite beautiful. When you go into yourself and you go, let's say, through ego self-consciousness, you go up through what I call the observer mind, the objective mind, the rational mind, into the truth mind. You can experience within yourself forces of love, justice, truth, and beauty. From that, you can lift consciousness up to what I'll call the good, the holy, and into divine consciousness. Is not beyond the reach of any person watching this, either live or a recording. Everyone can do this. If you're not able to do it, it just takes practice. It takes work. And the practice is just as I've described it. You sit, you clear your mind of all distractions, you stop thinking about things to do, projects, especially any agendas where someone's to blame, either you or somebody else. You let go of all of that. And you just try to breathe in, and I like to think of it this way. Try to imagine there's a quarry from which all souls are carved and put into reality. And in that quarry, we're all one. We're all part of divine consciousness. All souls come from the same quarry. This is a Kabbalistic idea. And then the quarry is mined, as it were, and souls go into the world. And now we have to try to imagine this world of souls from the quarry of the infinite. And let's say there's some kind of infinite symphony, some kind of infinite dance going. It's like the angels in heaven. We're swirling about each other. You find this in the liturgy. We are sovavim. We're swirling about each other. The divine is the misovev, is that which sets the swirling into motion, and we are swirling around each other. You'll see this idea straight out of the liturgy, the swirling of souls, the swirling of the angels, and the divine is the one who sets the swirling into motion. We are sovavim and mistovavim. We're swirling around each other. We are the agents of the swirling, and the divine puts it into motion. Just try to capture that mystical idea. Hold that idea for a moment. And then you imagine as the soul descends into the world of klipot, as the soul descends into the world of husks, it begins to fragment into what you might call our spiritual personalities. There's a high-level functioning of a personality and the low-level functioning of a personality. Suddenly we become people interested in justice, but the lower levels of justice are resentment, judgmentalism, etc. There's a personality focused in love, and the lower level of that is the person desperately seeking approval, and when they don't get it, they become depressed or furious. Think of all the different personality types where the soul now becomes, as it were, a certain type of soul, the different levels of the soul, the highest levels of the soul, and the levels of the soul that are the most broken, that cause the most damage. Now, as these souls descend, my soul, your soul, as they descend into the world, they take on that spiritual character. They lose connection with their true nature, what I'll say, the upper nature of the soul. They lose connection to the quarry. They lose connection to the divine dance, the divine swirling. We're down in this world, and we have forgotten everything. We've forgotten our source. We've forgotten our true nature. We're just down here, sometimes in the lower dimensions of our soul, just fighting it out, feeling bad, making other people feel bad. And when you look at this perspective of souls that have forgotten their true nature, remember when in the book called the Ethical Will of the Baal Shem Tov, a collection of his teachings put together by his students, the first line the students write in the Baal Shem Tov's Ethical Will, remember, he didn't write it, his students compiled it based on his teachings. The first line is, the main problem is shechacha, is forgetfulness. We forget our source, we forget where we're from, we forget our true nature. So part of what the process of Rosh Hashanah, the process of transformation is, from my perspective, is recollection, is overcoming forgetfulness and restoring ourselves to that initial promise as a human being. So we overcome that forgetfulness, and we start to have a restored sense of self. For me, if you're interested in transformation, if you're able to tolerate a mystical, contemplative starting point, as the spot recommends, it's really extraordinary to gain this mystical, contemplative perspective on things. And from this mystical, contemplative perspective, before you start to deal with other human beings, you realize you first have to deal with your own forgetfulness. You've forgotten who you are. You've forgotten your true nature. By the way, last night we had a beautiful poem read to us by Shanti about the blessing. And in this really interesting poem, the blessing is, as it were, an emanation from the divine, and the blessing encounters us. Normally we think of that either God blesses us or we say a blessing toward the divine. Here a blessing confronts us. And the blessing, as it were, encounters us. And the blessing speaks to us. It's in the Shabbat update. There's a link there. An extraordinary poem. It's a kind of a poem with which you should begin every single day of your life. I have it printed out right here, and I'm going to treasure it. Now, once you start there, I want to now take a practice of the month of Elul. I want to run it through this idea and show you how it fits. So let's say we all know that one of the practices during Elul is to forgive others and to ask for forgiveness. Many people find that tough. They don't want to forgive others. They think that what other people have done is unforgivable. They don't want to ask for forgiveness because it's too shame-producing to admit that one has done wrong. So the unconscious ego self gets in the way. The Yetzer Hara gets in the way. So now, stand way back and think for a moment that two pure souls, we say, Elohai neshama shenatata bi tohora. The pure soul, has descended, and now we're wronging each other, we're hurting each other. So it's not you and another person. It's two souls that have descended into forgetfulness. So think about you and the person you're upset with. The person is upset with you. And we have a record of offenses, and we don't want to forgive. Or we've done something and it's very hard for us to admit it. Look at yourself as a stranded soul. Now, from this higher perspective, you are not the same thing as your unconscious ego self. You're above your unconscious ego self. You can see that your unconscious ego self is stranded. You can see that the unconscious ego self of another person is stranded. And from this perspective, it's no longer, do I forgive them, do they forgive me? But rather it's two stranded souls. Two stranded souls. And then you take a deep breath and you say, how can I heal this tragedy? It's outside the perspective of ego interest. It's not, as it were, I'm forgiving you, you're forgiving me. But we're two souls who can see the stranded unconscious ego self. And we're asking ourselves, how do we save them? Now, I don't mean in some sense of saving from eternal damnation. I'm saying save from our tendency to lose connection with our source, connection with our nature. So I want to offer this as an initial step of Rosh Hashanah, that we are descended from the quarry of souls. As the original state where the souls are a symphony, the souls are all misovavim, the souls are all revolving around each other in some kind of pure dance form. If the meditation doesn't work for you, think of a different one. I happen to love it. That we descend into a world where the klipa of the unconscious ego self takes charge. We lose our connection with the blessing. We lose our authentic connection with each other, connection with the divine, connection with what I'll call the upper nature of our souls. And we wake up into this condition, and we want to transform. We want to transform our lives. We want to effect transformation with others. One of the most common questions I get is, how do I change the spouse, the wife, the husband, the kid? Why aren't they better? Why aren't they changing? Well, the main thing you can do is not see them as something that needs to change initially. Of course, people do need to change. But essentially, from this perspective, a person that needs to remember. Once a person can remember their divine source, once a person can remember Rosh Hashanah, the moment before the Hitchalkut, the moment before they became a being invested in the self-interest of the ego self. What does it mean to help another person remember? From my perspective, we must model what it means to be people who remember their essential source. If you can model that as much as you can, if you can model being a person who's connected with your essential source, you're able to calm down. You're able to live lives of reconciliation, where you create as much peace as possible within standing by firm, clear boundaries, standing for reconciliation and peace, not making things worse. If you can be that person, if you can model that person, one thing I've seen over and over again is when we model the non-angry, the non-defensive, the non-resentful, the non-guilty, the non-shamed person, if we can model something different, we help other people remember what that's like. Is that we are reminders. Just as the tzitzit is so that we remember God's commandments, we can in many ways function as a tzitzit for another person. They look upon us and they can remember that there's a different way to be. So I'd like us to start on our process toward Rosh Hashanah, happening in exactly a month, if I'm not mistaken. And Rosh Hashanah is on a Friday night, Shabbat, that we begin this process of remembering the source of our own being.